and we want to get them off our chest before the end of the day. And so Jim Bob Tinsley here will be the moderator, or he'll be in charge of the workshop. He's been introduced before, but let me tell you a little bit about his background. He was with Gene Autry. I don't know if any of you young people know Gene Autry, but he was, well, yeah, a few. He was my hero when I grew up after Tom Mix died.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah. You were my third hero, Jim Bob. And Jim Bob's been all over the country. He and his wife with the movie productions and that type of thing. And he's got a book out about cowboy songs. And what's the title of it again, Jim?
He was singing this song, Jim.
All right.
Joe.
What is it? He was singing this song. That's right. And it's a history, not only of the cowboy songs themselves, but a history of these songs. It's a beautiful book, and you might like to get a copy. Jim Bob will sign. There's a history of all the different songs in there, all the old cowboy classics that you've probably heard most of your life. So it's really a wonderful book, a nice collection item to have, and he'll be glad to sign it for you if you'd like to get one. I'm going to turn it over to Jim Bob now.
Thank you very much, Joe. This portion of the workshop is about legendary cowmen in Florida. We have modern legendary cowmen in Florida, but I think probably that the ones that you'd like to hear about and the ones that most of us are most familiar with are the old timers who really brought the cattle industry into Florida. I think Joe has mentioned a number of times that the first cattle in North America came into Florida with DeSoto, and probably some of them got loose. They claim that in the 1700s they found some up here on Payne's Prairie, just south of Gainesville. And now whether or not some of these really did, the Indians rounded them up, and whether some of them crossed over with the mealy mouth cattle from South Carolina and that area, is pure conjecture at this time. But anyway, they developed into a very adaptable, small Florida scrub cow here that could withstand heat and insects and all these things. Well, when the first ranchers came in here following and during the Seminole Wars, they pushed farther and farther south. And as they did, they pushed the Seminole Indians farther and farther south. So the ones that I think probably we'll talk about are those legendary cowmen who were in the, Columbia County, Florida was where most of them came to, a little town south of here, about 14 miles, by the name of Alligator. Now it goes by the name of Lake City. But most of those pioneer cattlemen came in here, and then they pushed further south. They said that Moses Barber, who came in here, he had the Barber's Station between here and Jacksonville, or between Lake City and Jacksonville, and it was used by the Union soldiers as headquarters. But Moses was Moses Barber was a cattleman, and he unfortunately he took the Seminoles cattle and drove them to market and sold them. And he had cattle all the way down to Barberville, just north of DeLand. And they said that he had a wife every day's drive between here and Barberville, and on down to a little community outside of Orlando, southeast of Orlando, called Shake Rag. And I don't know how it got its name, but it's down there just south. Well, the town isn't there anymore. There was another town there, Whittier. It's off the map also. But most of these cattlemen moved south, and the ones that moved into the Fort Ogden, DeSoto County, Arcadia area in there is the ones that most of us talked about yesterday. Mr. Mills and I were talking a while ago about F.A. Hendry, Captain F.A. Hendry, who was one of the pioneer cattlemen down there. I think he can say a few words about him. We talked yesterday about H.T. Lykes, of the famed Lykes Beef Packers and Shipping Company. We talked some about Zybe King, who was a cattle baron. We talked about Jake Summerlin, who was one of the largest cattle barons in the state of Florida. He, when Orange County was formed, part of his property, well, most of Orlando was his property then. Well, he built, not only gave the land to build a courthouse, but built a wooden courthouse there for Orange County, their first courthouse. There's Summerlin streets and avenues down there. There was a Summerlin Institute in Bartow. He was a member of the legislature. He was a judge. We talked mostly probably yesterday about old Bone Mizell, who is probably the most legendary cowman, and well, he is a cowboy, but he did go into the cattle business himself a little bit. Now, he left his mark on the Florida cattle industry. Admittedly, sometimes that mark was on somebody else's cow, though. But Bone is probably the most famous of all cracker cowboys. We'll talk about him. Who would like to start out? Vic, you told me a few moments ago you thought of some old timers that you wanted to talk about.
Well, there's one or two in particular, and now I don't. Old man Buck Daughtry, he lived down at all between Fort Myers, Punta Gorda is where he was from, Punta Gorda. And back then, now this is 50 years ago, and I don't think he's in Joe's book, but he should have been. But, you know, back then, nobody owned the land. The state owned the land. And the cowmen that could keep their cattle on the land, they could keep the little fellers pushed out and keep everybody else pushed out. Them old cattlemen back then, they wanted all of their territory and everything that joined it. So they took up most of the grazing land. And old man Buck was kind of pushed out. So, but between 41 and the coast, he would take his dogs, and he had a pretty good herd. And he would drive that herd from the Myakka River around to Sarasota, and he would go inland from Sarasota and then cut back around and on the coast, and he would push them cattle to the Manatee River, him and his dogs. Now, he wasn't driving them, he was grazing them. He would graze them up there, and then he would turn around and graze them back. And that's the way he grazed his herd for a year or two, which I know I saw him do it, so that's why I know that happened. That's one thing I wanted to tell you. And I'll get the other later on.
That last thing you said, I'll get the other later on, okay? How about it? You got some stories here?
In this country, I talked about them yesterday, that Sam Martin, and which is the banker at Branford, and Byron Martin, his son, and Clyde Martin, they own the herd of cattle from Branford down to Old Town, from Old Town back in the Cross City and back in Tiger Ridge and back through that section.
There wasn't a fence anywhere around, was there?
PK?
No fences at all in there.
No fences at all. That they was grazing them all the way through. Then the next cattleman in this country was the Green Chairs and Tom Chairs, and he had a son named Howell Chairs, and their cattle range from Old Town to the mouth of the Suwannee River. And then the Fortners that we spoke about this morning had cattle over in Taylor County, but the Tolls, there's three of the brothers, and they had their cattle from Lafayette County over in Mayo and on through Taylor County and into the coast. And that was 3 and 4 of the biggest cattle growers in the country. Well, there's 3 of them was the biggest cattle growers that started. Fortner, he started in later years. And they had a number of cattle drives, and they shipped them out and drive them to the boxcars and ship them out. So that's where these longhorn cattle got started in this country here and in North Florida. I know more about this North Florida than I do on the South Florida that they're speaking about.
George?
Well, I'm not as old as some of these fellows, but I spent the better part of my years in the woods, so Maybe the age don't have a lot to do with it. It depends on what you was doing as an occupation. I'm not going to especially refer to no one individual, but I've been a cow hunter ever since I was about 15 years old. And I'll get back to some of the dipping days. I went down in Collier County when I was a little less than 15 years old, about 15 years old, and an old-timer by the name of Ed Flood and a fellow in Polk County by the name of Tom Henry. They owned a bunch of cattle down there in the glades, and they had dipped out a portion of them and was going to move them out of that country. Back then, you can't believe what I'm fixing to tell you concerning what we call the horseflies. You would see a group of men coming across the woods, and he'd have a sack over his horse's head down to his front of his saddle with a holes cut for his nose and his eyes. He'd have another sack hung over the horse's rump tied to the back of his saddle. He'd have another sack around the horse's belly tied up to the skirts of his saddle to keep the horseflies from eating his horse up while he was trying to ride along. And, of course, he had one hand fanning horseflies all this time. And if you went to the camp during the middle of the day for lunch, you sat trying to eat dinner with one hand and knocking horseflies with the other. So we gathered a bunch of these cattle and had to drive them about 11 miles from the cow pens through the woods to Mockalee. And there was one old scrub bull that kind of gave out, so we just dropped him out. And when we came back along that afternoon, going back to the camp, the horseflies had killed that bull. And we had us a circle, about a 10-foot circle made right out from the camp, and had it fenced with hog wire, and had a pile of sawdust inside of this fenced-in little area. And the horses, the only satisfaction they got was standing just as close to that smoke as they could, standing and stomping and switching their tails. And if you rested any during noon hour, had any time to rest, you got under your mosquito bar to keep the horseflies from eating you up. Also, somebody asked me yesterday afternoon after the show was over concerning what started the fences in the state of Florida. Well, I'm basically speaking of our end of the state. We had dipped down there and dipped and had miles and miles in different counties, and they couldn't clear it up. Every now and then another bunch of cattle would show up that hadn't been dipped, so that would keep you right under the dipping pressure right on. So they decided to build miles and miles of what we call bumper fence. Got busy and built these fences every 3 or 4 or 5 miles, and maybe a mile apart, but they might be 5 or 6 miles long. And you'd clean up a bunch of cattle in that area and get the okay on them, and then you'd move over into another area and clean these cattle up. But up until that point, there was no way of cleaning them up because they were mixing and mangling all the time. But finally, that all came to a head through the fencing program. Well, that was just a common word for a man like myself. That's the reason you asked the question, probably. I mean, we finally eradicated the tick in that particular bunch of cattle. And then you had to get over into another bunch of cattle that was infested and do the same thing for them. This thing went on for about 3 years, and it was dipping them every 14 days to try to get ahead of that tick.
That's what the dip was for, right?
Yes, ma'am.
That about 20 years ago, the tick came back, and cattle in South Florida were reinfested with it, and 17th Street in Ocala, Florida, as a precise spot, every cow south of 17th Street in Ocala had to be dipped, and they were forced to go to the cattle dipping stations. There's 2 of them in Ocala at that time, but I don't know what would have happened if one of them had gotten across 17th Street in Ocala. But yesterday we talked about, and probably some of you would like to hear some stories about Bone Mizell. And how many in here have heard of Bone Mizell? Well, he's probably Florida's most famous cracker cowboy. He was born in 1863 down on Horse Creek in what is now DeSoto County. And he died at Fort Ogden Depot in 1921. I've got a book almost finished about Bone, only 1 chapter left, and I've got a copy of his death certificate I got up in Jacksonville. It said cause of death, moonshine, went to sleep and didn't wake up. and he was noted for his drinking and his tall stories. And I'm going to tell one here that we didn't tell yesterday, but it's probably the crowning stunt of his life. He was a fabulously funny fella. If stories didn't originate with him and they told him about it, he went ahead and accepted it anyway. But in the 1930s, a lady who was a newspaper reporter down in Miami wrote a story about a poem that she called Ballad of Bone Mizell. Well, she's been dead a number of years ago, for a number of years. And I went to see her daughter, who lives down in Orlando, and got permission to put music to it. So I recorded the Ballad of Bone Mizell and got it on an album over there. But let me tell you about this ballad. It's the crowning stunt of Bone Mizell's life. It's been told in cow camps ever since the 1880s, Kissimmee, Arcadia, LaBelle, Fort Thompson, you name it. And it's had the different names and different places. But Bone went in to see the editor Stout of the Fort Myers Press back in the late 1880s and told him the story and gave the names of the persons, except the young Jewish boy. Now, it seems that Bone and a bunch of the cowboys, cow hunters, were out in the 90 Mile Prairie area, and old John Underhill, now the ballad says Bill Red, but it's got to rhyme with another word in there, but the name was John Underhill. He was working with the same group of boys out there, and he died. Well, it was they couldn't bring him out and bury him, so they just buried him out there on 90 Mile Prairie, Bone and some of his fellow cow hunters. Well, a couple years later, a young Jewish boy from New Orleans who had been all around the country, been in foreign countries, had all the money his parents did that they knew what to do with. But he wanted to get it away from it all. He went down in the Arcadia area, and he just happened to get into a bunch of cow hunters where Bone was with them. They were out on 90 Mile Prairie, and this young boy took sick and died. Well, they couldn't bring him in. They didn't have a flat-bottom boat to him out of the prairies and high water in there, so they buried him next to old John Underhill. Well, the Jewish boy's parents down in New Orleans found out where he had gone to, and they got in touch with the people there in Arcadia and asked about him and said, yeah, he was worked for the Parkers, and that he died out on 90 Mile Prairie, and they buried him out there. So they said to get in touch with Bone Mizell. So Bone said yes, said we buried him out there, and they sent money to have his remains dug up and sent back to New Orleans. Well, Bone and let's see, another one's name was Joe. Well, I can't think of it now. But anyway, they went out there and they got out there, and old John Underhill and the Jewish boy were lying side by side there in graves, you know. And Bone remembered what the young Jewish boy had said. He'd been everywhere and just wanted to be right there in that cow country. And he remembered old John Underhill said that he had never been anywhere. He'd always wanted to take a train ride. Now, see some of you laughing. You're kind of getting ahead of me now. So this actually happened. Bone said old John never had taken a train ride and says, let's just give him a good train ride. So they dug John Underhill up and shipped him to New Orleans. And the young Jewish boy still rests down there and in the sanctity that he wanted to be a part of. True happenings. Anybody else got a Bone story?
I can vouch where this cemetery is. It's out on the prairie east of Arcadia in a little scrub, and this scrub is called 4 Mile Island. There's several old-timey pioneers buried on this very scrub that you're speaking of.
Well, John Underhill used to be buried there, but he's not anymore. As a matter of fact, they say that poor old John Underhill rests under a $3,000 monument in New Orleans.
I heard a kind of a parody on that same story. I don't know if it's a different story, but it was told by Ruby Carson. Is that the one you? Ruby Carson. And this was told by her, but I think somebody else picked it up and changed it a little bit. But, Bone would hunt. When he wasn't hunting cows, he was out hunting game. And a lot of these...
or liquor.
That's right. He had a John Barleycorn was his favorite friend, just about. But the cowboys or the cowmen, they had a hard time making it, just working cattle 4 or 5 months out of the year. And usually they did something else. And Bone Mizell was a crack shot. If you ever wanted to make a movie, and he was around... you had a replacement there for Gary Cooper or some of the Western stars that we know so much about today. He had that kind of reputation. But he would take people out hunting, and the story is very much like the story that Jim Bob told here. There was a fella down from New England, I think Vermont, a young fella, and they were out hunting, and he got horse-throwed and broke his neck, and he died out there on the prairie somewhere. And there were 2 or 3 hunters, and they buried him. And later the family wrote somebody there in Arcadia, it might have been Judge King, and asked that the remains of their son be sent back to New England. And there was an old derelict, an old drunk there that used to hang out around the depot all the time that Bone knew, who had just died a few days before, and he was another one that always wanted to travel. So the story is that Bone put him in a box and sent him back to New England. Now, I don't know if that one's true or not. I think the one that Jim Bob told is true, but this other one is... if half the stories about Bone are true, well, he's the most interesting character that American history knows about, just about, at least.
Bone got drunk in Arcadia one night, and some of his buddies, he passed out, and some of his buddies took him out to the Joshua Creek Cemetery and laid him out next to a tombstone out there, and left one of the guys to see what he did when he came out of his stupor, and he hid behind a tombstone or a tree, one or something, and waited, and finally Bone came to and looked up, and he says, "Damn," he says, "it's Resurrection Day, and I'm the first one up."
This might be a little beside the point, but my wife's grandfather raised 9 children in a covered wagon, going to and fro from Melbourne to Fort Myers during the winter months, trapping and trolling a bunch of hogs along, feeding them on acorn. Anyhow, he was camped in what we call Mizell Hammock right north of Brighton, which is a highway going out of Okeechobee toward Arcadia. Anyhow, he had his little family camped in this Mizell Hammock this particular time. And one morning when they got up, his team of horses was gone. He never found hiding a hair of them. And the old fellow led me to believe that Bone Mizell was the very man that come there that night and got his team of horses. So he had to walk about 14 miles across the prairie to Bassinger and borrowed a bunch of horses from an old-timer, an old cowman there at Bassinger by the name of Willie Williams, and rode one of these horses back across the prairie and led the other one and hitched him to his wagon and drove to Bassinger and stayed at Bassinger on the Williams place until he worked that pair of horses out with the old man on the grove. But he always felt like that Bone Mizell was the man that come up during the night and got his team of horses.
Vic, what kind of story you got?
Well, I've got a little different kind of story. You hear all these bad things that people do, but you never hear nothing about the good things. And I want to tell about one cattleman down here in Florida that I thought was a pretty good kind of feller. He's still living. Maybe some of y'all know him. Is Clyde Bailey. He was a cattleman and a farmer, and he made quite a bit of money. But the country had sold out. He couldn't get no range. He couldn't get no range to run his cattle on. So he figured out some way or another the way he was going to do this. So he helped other cattlemen. And he'd find a cowman that had some pasture that didn't have enough money to stock his place. And Clyde would work out a deal with him. He'd stock the man's place with cattle, and they'd figure them cattle is worth so much. And Clyde would take 40% of what those cattle brought in every year and let the other man take the 60% to run the place on, until he got the cattle paid for. And then when he got them paid for, they would still own them on a 60-40 basis. In the meantime, Clyde had never collected no interest. That 40% that he was getting took care of the interest and everything. So he put several people in the cow business that couldn't afford it any other way, and they couldn't get credit from the bank. So I think that makes him a legendary cowman.
I'm going to back Vic up a little bit there in that particular man. I worked for Mr. Clyde Bailey about 4 years, and we were gathering the cattle over on the Ocklawaha River one particular roundup, and him and I was riding down against the river marsh, and I had been talking to him about how I'd like to become a little more established. And of course, I was just living on a little farm there out from Wildwood and working with him at this time. And we were riding along there, and he said, George, he said, that's natural with all of us. But he said, now let me tell you what I want to tell you. He said, you will go home tonight when we get back to Oxford, and he said, you'll get a good night's rest. And he said, I'll go home too. But he said, while you getting that good night's rest, he said, I'll be laying up there looking at the ceiling, trying to figure out what and how my next moves are going to be to keep everything turning. But I will say one thing. He is one of as good a cowman as I ever worked a day for in my life.
Who was it yesterday up here that was talking about the Lykes brothers? Was it you, Joe? Yeah. Let them know a little bit something about the Lykes brothers down there in Tampa.
Well, I mentioned yesterday that Dr. H.T. Lykes was the one that really got the cattle business going, and he was an M.D. He came to Florida to practice medicine. I believe he was from South Carolina, like so many early Floridians were. And one of the things that upset him was that there was not enough facilities for practicing medicine where he lived. Let's see, I forget that spot, but it was down close to Hillsborough County. Spring Hill or Spring Lake? Spring Hill, I believe it was, yeah. And he had a place there, but he decided to get into the cattle production. And at that time, most of the cattle that were raised here in Florida, and of course this is always an interesting question that comes up, what did the people do that raised all these cattle in Florida? Because who bought these cattle? Because there weren't many railroads here then. The railroads didn't really start coming in until 1890 or so. Where did they send these cattle? Who bought them? Well, a lot of them went to Cuba and all over the West Indies, but particularly to Havana. Thousands and thousands of head of cattle went there at the end of the Civil War, and when they would sell them to these Cubans, they're really Spanish. Cuba was part of Spain then. They would pay them in gold, in Spanish gold. And this was at the end of the Civil War when times were tough down here during Reconstruction. And it was very difficult to get any kind of money. I was talking to Mr. Rowell this morning. He was talking about how a dollar would go a long way back then, but nobody had a dollar, you see. And nobody had those few pennies or whatever you needed. And so a lot of these cattlemen, like Dr. Lykes, and Jacob Summerlin and F.A. Hendry and the Knights and John Leslie and so on, they would sell their cattle to the Cubans and get paid in gold, in Spanish gold. And that came to be known as cattleman's money, that gold. And it's said that a lot of ranchers' kids would take a gold piece and they would put it in an old tobacco can and seal it, and they would shake it and use it as a rattle. You can imagine what that gold would be worth now. Jacob Summerlin, one of the famous cattlemen that Jim Bob talked about, had a lot of that gold. But anyway, Dr. Lykes went into business with a fellow named Bill Tolles, who was from Taylor County. The Tolles still live in Taylor County, the same family. And they went into business at Fort Myers and bought some land there. And let's see, I believe most of their cattle, though, they shipped out. They shipped some out from a place called Punta Rasa. And also they had some cattle pens built at Tampa, and they would be picked up there at Tampa Bay and shipped to Cuba. But anyway, Dr. Lykes was a wise investor. And unlike Bone Mizell, he was very careful of what he did with his money. And his business began to grow. And then he had, I believe it was 7 sons, if I'm not mistaken. But those sons, when they grew up and they went away to college, he would make them work, either on the ranch or in some phase of the family enterprise. The Lykes brothers have the largest steamship line, American steamship line in the world. But the thing I wanted to emphasize was it all started with cattle. They had some vast holdings down in Cuba. Charlie Lykes is very active in the cattle business now, and he's in charge, I believe, I'm right, Faye, about this, but he's in charge of the Florida cattle operation. Is that right? Down towards Fish Eating Creek? Yeah, and he's just the nicest fellow you'd ever want to meet. He won't let you call him Mr. Lykes. He wants to be called Charlie. And he knows his cattle. But that
south of Arcadia and established a ranch down there. And he bought cattle. Excuse me. And in 1861, he signed a contract with the Confederate Army, in which he was to ship cattle by rail from South Georgia to the Confederate forces. Well, they drove these cattle all the way from south part of DeSoto County all the way to Baldwin, Florida, up here on 301, right there to almost at the state line. And it took 40 days to drive those cattle up there. The Union forces attacked them quite a bit along the way, so a band of cattlemen got together and called themselves the Cow Cavalry. They didn't trail the cattle, but they were just went along to help protect the drovers and their cows. After the Civil War, then Jake Summerlin started shipping cattle from Punta Rassa, that Joe alluded to here a moment ago, from Punta Rassa by ship to Key West, as well as ports in Havana. They drove those cattle out of the Kissimmee area down through DeSoto County and picked up more along at cow pens along the ways where cattlemen would have their cows penned up, and they'd pick them up on the way. They had 2 places that they swam these cattle across the Caloosahatchee River. One was up at Fort Thompson, and another one was closer down to just south of Fort Ogden. I can't think of the name of it. Elba or
Felda.
Right. And they swam these cattle across the Caloosahatchee River onto the south side, and then it took about 3 days to get from there down to Punta Rassa. The last part of the marsh in there, about a half mile of marshland, they built a corduroy road out of the trees, out of palm trees. Built this corduroy road and drove those cattle over there. And when they got to the shipping pens there, those cattle were loaded. Some of them were on chutes that went into the bottom of the ship. But the ones that, if they had enough, then they would yank these cows out one at a time, put a noose around their horns, lift them up on this winch, and swing it all the way around and down onto the top deck of the ship. And they said it was a very unusual sight that they to try to keep driving them in there. I've got accounts of people there that said that they were awake all night long because they had rocks and maybe some of those gold coins that you were talking about in tin cans and rattling those to try to get the cows on board ship. And it said it was a wild thing to witness these cattle operations at the shipping point.
One of the legendary cattlemen this time that I made reference to a minute ago is a fellow named John Leslie. The Leslie family still in Tampa. I don't think any of them are involved in cattle. They are involved in citrus. But John Leslie went all over the state, just like Jake Summerlin did, buying up cattle from different people. And I was lucky enough to get his account book. His nephew let me borrow it a while. And he also had a diary. And Vic was talking about how some of these cattlemen like Clyde Bailey would help other smaller people out, and John Leslie was like this. In fact, he acted as a banker, using his own cash often and letting other people have money that wanted to get started. People like the Youngs down in Hillsborough County. But he would also go to Cuba, and he would be in Havana when those shiploads of cattle would come in there. Now, he would buy those cattle for $5 a piece out on the prairie, out on the Palmetto Prairie in Florida, $5 and $6 a piece. And then he would sell them to the Cubans. It seems to me like they got about $15 a head back then. But one of the things I noticed in one of his diaries was he was talking about unloading cattle there at Havana, and he was talking about how some of the cattle had broken legs from traveling over. Now, some of the ships that they put those cattle in, the chute would run up over the hull, and they would just push that cow in there, and he'd fall down in there. And usually he fell all right. These cattle was tough anyway and pretty light. But once in a while, one would break a leg and that type of thing. And I noticed in that diary he would make a reference, usually maybe one or two out of a whole carload or whole shipload that came in there. But he was an interesting person. You know, the thing I was talking to a preacher. We had a revival last week back in Madison. I was talking to the preacher there, and he had read this book called The Florida Cowmen, and he said a lot of people talked to him in his congregation about Florida cow people and the Florida cattle industry, and didn't realize that Florida was such a big cattle state, and that the cattle industry really started here. It started here with the Spanish in 1640. But he pointed out, he says, you know, if Hollywood had been located in Florida, I don't mean Hollywood, Florida, but Hollywood, California, he said the American public would be talking about Arcadia and know about Arcadia or Fort Meade or Fort Ogden rather than Dodge City and Abilene, you see. But that was all part of, you know, the horse culture and the cowboy mystique that was really developed by Hollywood, which is good, but sort of left Florida out, and that's a shame, I think. But I think more and more people are becoming conscious of the fact that there were people like Jake Summerlin and people like Dr. Lykes and John Leslie and so on, who a fellow named Collier came down here. I think he had 23 kids and several wives. I remember that.
I hope so.
And he was what you called a herder. He really, it was before you had ranchers. He never lived in a same place. I mean, he just moved all over the prairie down there in South Florida. This was in the 1840s. That was before the Civil War. But there are a lot of stories left untold out there about the Florida cowmen and the cattle industry here in Florida. And I hope that they'll all be told one day.
Joe mentioned the fact that Hollywood should have been down in Arcadia. Arcadia, just the one area there around Arcadia back in the 1880s and 1890s and the first part of 1900, they had a cattle war. They had duels in the street. They had, well, before it was Arcadia, it was called Tater Hill Bluff, the village was. They had vigilante movements out of Sarasota that came over in there, but because of some of the cattle shenanigans that were going on. They had, as I say, duels in the street. They had lynchings. They had hangings. They had cowboys. And Frederick Remington mentions this. Any of you that get a chance to read his article in Harper's New Monthly Magazine, he wrote a letter to his friend Owen Wister, who wrote to Virginian, and wanted him to come down to Arcadia and see these strange fellows that herded cows and shot up trains as they passed through there, because they worked for these big cattlemen, and every once in a while the train would hit one of those cows, and it got to the point that they were shooting into passenger trains and piling trees and stumps and things up on at least two bridges, Bridge 19 and Bridge 20 between Arcadia and Zolfo Springs, and would shoot up these trains. The train hired what they called a cattle attorney or cow attorney fight these cases, but in most cases it didn't matter over $5 or $10, so they just went ahead and paid them up. But it was a wild Southwest, not Southwest United States, but a wild Southwest Florida. And one other thing about some of the cowboys getting started in the cattle industry, Judge Zybe King, that we talked about some yesterday down in DeSoto County, if a cowboy or a cow hunter of his proved himself and he was a valuable man, he gave every fifth calf to one of the men that worked for him. He took 4 and gave one to one of the cowboys that worked for him, the fifth calf. And some of them built up quite sizable herds by this method. So even though Judge Zybe King, a lot of strange stories are told about him, he still, as some of these others have mentioned, he did have an affection for these people that wanted to get, these small men that wanted to get into the cattle business.
I'm sorry.
Go ahead. No.
There's another custom that you may not know about. These cattlemen that had these big herds, like Jacob Summerlin and John Leslie, they didn't mind you stealing cattle from them. If you just went out there to steal a cow to eat, that was all right. They wouldn't bother you, just for your family. It was only when you started stealing large quantities to sell to somebody else that they would get upset. But if you wanted to just kill an occasional cow or something, to feed your family, they understood that. They knew people had to eat. And so that was a custom of the Florida frontier. I don't know if that really existed on the western frontier or not. It probably did, but they understood that. If you wanted to, you had to have, everybody had to have something to eat, and so that often happened.
It's about time we went to the barn, but if anybody's got any questions they'd like to ask any member of the panel, why just bell her out.
One of the best things that happened to the cattle industry, it hadn't been mentioned too much, was when the no fence law come in, especially up in North Florida. Because fellas that had big herds of cattle and on the open range, they'd turn them in, drive them in on a section of land which people was farming different places, and these cows would tear in the fields and eat the crops. And you try to get one of them to do something about it, and he'd tell you to fix your fence. So one time it was fella Smith over here at Suwannee County, he drove his cows in on a fella Stewart Altman over in near Branford. And Altman went to Smith and told him that he'd put his cows out and fixed his fence, and he wanted him to move them. And all Smith would tell him is, move your cows. So Altman told him, he said, I've fixed my fence, and this rifle with these box of cartridges that I got, so I'll keep it fixed. So they wouldn't move them. He started shooting them cows, and it covered that country so the buzzards like taking everybody around that part. And them cows would move pretty quick, and that did change the attitude of the cattleman of not imposing on the farmer. Because I've drove a many one out of the field, and by the time I'd get back to the house, when it done jumped up on a rail fence and knocked it down, I'd have to go ahead and spend the afternoon running it. So I think when we got the fence law where we had cattle on pasture, we were raising better cattle, and it started people making a little money on the cattle situation, and then started planting permanent pasture. So I feel that that's what really started the cattle industry over, and put it on a paying proposition, because way back then a man didn't get too much for a cow, and when he paid, he didn't have as many bills to pay probably, but still, later on, with the price we get for cows today, warrants you taking care of your cows.
You had to drive with caution back then too, because you never knew what curve you might come around, and the road would be full of cattle. This buddy and I, one time, we borrowed another friend's car we had dates over in West Florida, and we were driving over there, and everything went fine. We had our dates, and on our way back, and about 4 o'clock in the morning, and we were pretty well oiled up, and he said, "Let me drive a little while," and I said, "Okay." So the next thing I knew, I kind of dozed off or passed out one. I don't remember which, but anyway, the first thing I knew, I looked up, and here was a big Brahma bull's rump right in front of the windshield. He had hit it right in the middle of the. We came on into town, and the left headlight was pointing up in the trees on the right hand side of the road, and the right headlight was pointing up in the trees on the left hand side of the road, and all the water was out, and it was just, it just knocking like everything, and we parked it in his backyard. And the next morning he got up and looked at it, and he called us, and he said, "What the hell happened to my car?" We told him we were at a dance and had the car parked there, and a truck backed into it and did all that damage. He says, "Well, what's all that manure doing on the windshield?" And I told him, I says, "Well, it was a cattle truck. It backed into it." So
that cow is just trying to tell you you shouldn't drink when you drive. You shouldn't drive when you drink.
Okay, question. What they wore? Well, as far as I've been able to find out, I got some stories from old timers, and their hat was just about like these boys in cow camp over here. They said that they paid 75 cents or $1 for their hats. They weren't fur felt; they were wool felt, and the longer they wore them, and the more sweaty they became, the more waterproof they became. The oldest ones wore boots that even came above their knees. And I've got a picture of Bone Mizell. We go back to Bone. I got a picture of his father, and those boots really look like wading boots that people wade in mountain streams to catch trout with. Oxford pants. I don't know what. Does anybody know what Oxford pants were? Yeah. Okay, and just cotton shirts, and some of them wore Brogan shoes.
Some of it was homespun. Some of the shirts. I've got the part of the diary of Sam Summerlin. I got a copy. I don't have the original, but he talks in there about how they made homespun shirts and that type of thing, which was common to all the frontier. I don't think you find a lot of difference really in the dress. When they were doing this cow camp down at Lake Kissimmee, Richard Bartlett had called me. Because I'd been doing some research on this book, and from the pictures, that I found and so on, it's just about what Jim Bob said, and it was, I doubt that there was much difference between the way the Florida cowman dressed and his counterpart on the western frontier. Yeah, sometimes vest. I've got a picture of Jim Johnson in the latest edition of this Florida Cowman, and I believe he's got a vest on, but I've seen him with vest. He's got a neckerchief and a Stetson, and he's got a gun belt and a sidearm. Right, yeah.
Yeah, long. Joe's got yours on today.
I got mine. Yesterday I wore a short sleeve shirt, and I told everybody I'm just a drugstore cowboy. All I've done is do some research on it. And they said they knew I was because I had a short sleeve shirt on. Only the real cowboys always had long sleeve shirts. So.
I want to speak a little bit concerning camping with the Seminole Indians in years gone by, back in the 30s. The 101 Ranch was owned by an old man in Sebring by the name of Fritz Williams, and he worked sometimes as high as a half a dozen of these Indians. And, of course, we all slept under the same camp shed. And if you don't believe it's kind of a misery to sleep between two old buck Indians, just get good and tired out and let them get good and tired out, and they'll put on some snoring for you. But anyhow, I was going to tell you how he sleeps almost in his shirt tail, and the first thing he does when he gets up every morning, he reaches around and gets his bandana. He ties that bandana around his neck, and then he reaches and gets his hat, puts that on. And he gets his pants in, puts them on, of course, and his shoes is the last thing he puts on. But anyhow, we used to have an old Indian, he was one of the oldest Indians living down on the Brighton Reservation, Frank Shoals. He wouldn't sleep in the camp shed with us. He slept out in his pickup truck. In 34, we was down there on the Harney Pond Canal, which is part of the Indian Reservation now. And we had some terrible bad weather during that particular winter, and I saw old Frank Shoals sleep out in that pickup truck under 2 blankets and on 1 blanket, and I was sleeping with 3 or 4 blankets on me and almost about to freeze to death then. But anyhow, I've had some experiences from all types of cowboying life.
I think that about winds us up. I wonder if anyone else has anything they'd like to. Jim Bob, did you want to say anything else here? No, I'm fine. Okay. Anyone else like to add anything to this august discussion here?
This is me.
Okay, I'm sorry. I'm always a little ahead of time, I guess.
We appreciate you people coming, and if you've got any questions about it, just come up here and ask them, or we'll stay here for a few more minutes if anybody's got anything they'd like to ask us about.
Jim Bob.
Yes, sir.
I've got a little story. It's not about the Florida cowmen, it's about the cowmen in Texas, but it's just a little story that they might like to hear.
Okay, Vic's got a little story about some cowboys.
This all happened in the cattle driving days from Texas up into Kansas, and all these people was driving trail herds up there. Well, there was a bunch of Mexicans gathered up a bunch of cattle down on the Rio Grande, and they took them to Abilene, and these Mexicans couldn't talk a word of English. But anyhow, they did get their cattle up to Abilene, and they sold them, but they couldn't talk English, and them buyers up there couldn't talk Mexican. And the buyers might near beat them out of their herd. They didn't have much money left. And anyhow, by the time they got drunk and spent a night or two in Abilene, they were broke. They headed back for the Rio Grande, and on the way out, they robbed a stagecoach about 10 miles out of Abilene. And the word got back to town that these Mexicans had robbed this stagecoach. So the sheriff, he gathered him up a posse, and he trailed them Mexicans, and he'd catch a few of them, and he'd kill them. And he got down to the last one. He killed them all but one. And he didn't have the money that he robbed this stagecoach from, so he took him back to Abilene and put him in jail. He sent to Kansas City and got an interpreter. So when the interpreter got there, well, the sheriff took his 6-shooter and he cocked it back and stuck it behind this Mexican's ear. He told the interpreter, he said, "You tell this Mexican if he don't tell us where the money's at, that I'm gonna pull the trigger." So the interpreter talked to the Mexican a little bit, and then the Mexican told him, he said it was buried out to an old line camp in a dry well, said it's in the bottom of that well. This interpreter told the sheriff, said the Mexican said he's a brave man and he's not afraid to die.
Thank you.